What you're seeing on screen would soon become evidence in one of the most shocking crimes in the United States. Tong Sha, a 19-year-old girl, crossed the world chasing a dream. But what awaited her wasn't a diploma, it was a suitcase. Stuffed into her own car trunk, bruised, broken, and silenced forever, Tong Sha's story began with brilliance and hope, and ended in one of the most haunting crimes to ever shake an American campus. Stay with us to uncover the dark truth behind her final days. "19-year-old Tong Sha was born in the bustling coastal city of Dalian in northeastern China, a metropolis home to over 6 million people. She was the only child of Chong Shang and Yang Shu, and the three shared an incredibly close bond. All were known for their strong work ethic, and from a young age, Tong stood out for her exceptional talents. She balanced both artistic and academic interests, excelling in piano, dance, and science, aspiring to one day become a biologist or sculptor. But those who knew her said Tong could have succeeded in any path she chose. She earned a place at Dalian Yuming Senior High School, one of the city's most prestigious institutions, known for producing top scorers in China's national college entrance exams, the Gaokao. While her then-boyfriend secured a place at a top Chinese university, Tong unfortunately did not make the cut. After years of hard work, the setback hit her hard, and it meant that her future plans were suddenly unclear. The relationship came to an end, and Tong made a bold decision to start over in a new country. She set her sights on the United States, specifically Iowa State University, to study chemical engineering. Her parents, ever supportive, gave her their entire life savings, equivalent to $100,000 to fund her studies and relocation. She still needed to complete a few requirements, including passing the English language proficiency exam. In July 2011, while in Beijing preparing for that exam, Tong met ex-Yan Li, who was also studying English. Li was bound for the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. They connected quickly, finding common ground in their shared journey. Two Chinese students about to move across the world to study in the U.S. Tong's parents met Li not long after. Though they found him respectful, quiet, and polite, they didn't think the two were a good long-term match. Others echoed this sentiment, but Tong reassured everyone that things between them weren't serious, they weren't exclusive, and it was nothing official. In September 2012, Tong officially began her studies at Iowa State University. From the outset, she maintained excellent grades and immersed herself in every facet of college life. Her friends described her as someone full of energy. When she wasn't studying, she was dancing, attending parties, or teaching Chinese to fellow students. She made friends effortlessly and became especially close to her roommates. Although she was the eldest among the three, they affectionately called her little sister due to her petite stature, just 5'2". Her best friend and roommate, Jean, remembered how academically gifted Tong was, often joking that her brilliance drove everyone crazy. She'd always claimed she needed to study more, yet consistently aced her classes and remained at the top. Despite the long distance, Tong continued to stay in contact with ex-Yan Li. However, he soon made a surprising move, deciding he could no longer handle being nearly 1,000 miles away from her. He applied to transfer to Iowa State University as well. Without a place to stay or any classes starting yet, he temporarily moved in with Tong and her roommates. Although they initially agreed, things quickly became uncomfortable. Li didn't socialize with anyone, avoided engaging with the group, and never helped with chores, leaving messes around the apartment. More troubling was his behavior toward Tong. He disliked her going out without him and frequently questioned her about her whereabouts and who she spent time with. Tong remained firm that their relationship wasn't serious, but she was now visibly growing tired of his increasingly possessive and controlling behavior. By this point, she was nearly 2 years into her degree, and everything else in her life seemed to be on track. Thankfully for her and her roommates, Li eventually found his own apartment and began attending classes. However, the distance didn't resolve all the issues. Tong began confiding in friends that she wanted to end the relationship for good and move forward. Tensions escalated further when Lee was stopped for traffic violations and gave Tong's address to the police as his own. This incident caused major friction in the household, and Tong's roommates became deeply uncomfortable, so much so that they didn't even want his name mentioned and made it clear that he was no longer welcome. On the 3rd of September, 2014, Tong had a conversation with someone who had recently become more than just a friend. Their bond had grown steadily, and romantic feelings had started to blossom. During the conversation, she confided that her relationship with Lee had been a source of stress and unhappiness for quite some time. Though she and Lee had already arranged a motel getaway for the upcoming weekend, Tong said she planned to go through with it and sort everything out once she got back. She expressed that it was likely they would soon break up for good. 4 days later, on the night of the 7th of September, Tong's father reached out by text. She had previously mentioned losing her glasses, and he wanted to know whether she had managed to replace them. Her response came back unusually curt. She simply said she had borrowed a pair from a friend. When he asked if they could have a video call, given that they hadn't caught up in a while, she declined, saying she was too busy. The exchange fell off, and her father was left disheartened by how quickly the conversation ended. That same night, one of Tong's roommates received a message as well. Only this one was from Lee's phone and came in at 1:30 a.m. It said that Tong was still in Iowa City but had lost her phone, so she was using Lee's SESD. The message added that Lee had a family emergency and might need to fly back to China, so Tong was going to take a bus to Minnesota to visit some friends and would return in a week. The message closed with a note that Lee's phone battery was running low. On Monday, the 8th of September, Tong was expected to return, especially since she had classes. Her continued absence came as a surprise, but it quickly evolved into concern. As the days passed with no word from her, Tong's friends and roommates decided to take action. They began reaching out to anyone who might have had recent contact with her, calling, texting, and checking online, but no one had heard anything. Her friend Jean even messaged people she knew in Minnesota through social media to check if Tong had arrived there. They hadn't seen her and didn't think she had shown up in town at all. On the 18th of September, after an extended period of silence, Tong's roommates finally reported her missing. Although police initially speculated that she might have grown homesick and returned to China, something not unheard of among international students, this theory was quickly ruled out. There was no evidence she had left the country, and nothing pointed to her ever boarding a bus to Minnesota. Investigators reached out to the other students she had been speaking with, but he had no answers either. Their relationship was still in its early stages, and he admitted that he didn't know her well enough to realize that her disappearance was out of the ordinary. That explained why he hadn't reported anything. He also provided an alibi, which police later confirmed. Word of Tong's disappearance quickly spread throughout campus and the wider community. Flyers were posted, and social media was flooded with pleas for help in finding her. Authorities turned to transaction records and interviews with her roommates to piece together her last known movements. This led them to discover that Tong and Lee had checked into the Budget Inn and Suites on the 5th of September, just as they had planned. The hotel owner, Ken, confirmed this detail, noting that he was familiar with the couple from past visits and didn't see anything out of the ordinary about their stay. Ken recalled seeing Tong walking around the hotel lobby alone on the 6th of September. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station also showed the couple purchasing bottled water, and nothing in the video seemed out of place. There was no sign that anyone had followed them or acted suspiciously. However, by the morning of Sunday, the 7th of September, Ken noticed that Tong's car was gone. The hotel room they had stayed in, room 218, was also empty, though no one had officially checked out. Unfortunately, due to a technical issue, the hotel's cameras had failed to capture footage of their departure. While checking out early wasn't entirely unheard of, Ken noted that it was unusual for this particular couple. They typically overstayed their checkout time and had to be reminded to leave, which made their quiet, early exit seem particularly odd. Authorities proceeded to search Tong's apartment and discovered a receipt for a car she had recently purchased. From that, they obtained her license plate number and distributed the make, model, and plate information to surrounding law enforcement agencies in hopes of tracking it down. They also secured search warrants for both Lee's apartment and the motel room the couple had stayed in. Upon entering Lee's apartment, officers found it to be in complete disarray. Items were scattered everywhere, and it appeared that some of his belongings had been hastily packed, as though he had left in a rush. At the motel, investigators found faint, dark-colored splatter marks on some of the walls and the headboard. However, without any clear evidence that a crime had occurred, it would take time and effort to justify swabbing and collecting forensic samples. Complicating matters further was the fact that several other people had stayed in the room since Tong and Lee's departure. Investigators then turned their attention to Lee's phone activity. Since Tong was supposedly in possession of Lee's phone, the data could potentially help them locate her, but what they found told a different story. Between the 5th of September and 8th, several calls had been made from the phone to someone named Paul. Most originated from Ames, Iowa, not Minnesota, as the message from Tong's supposed text had claimed. One call had even been made from China. The text claiming Tong was still in Iowa City had actually been sent from Chicago, where Lee had a delayed layover. Instead of waiting in Chicago, he traveled to Los Angeles and boarded a flight to China from there, taking his phone with him. This directly contradicted the story that Tong had the phone. Paul, the man on the receiving end of Lee's frequent calls, agreed to speak with police. He told them that Lee had contacted him requesting urgent help to buy a one-way ticket to China. Paul was confused by this sudden request, knowing that Lee still had classes, but Lee insisted it was an emergency without giving details. When Paul asked if he needed a return flight, Lee said no. At this point, investigators were confident that something terrible had happened to Tong. Lee was no longer just a person of interest. He was now a central suspect in her disappearance. On the 26th of September, 2014, a call came through reporting that Tong's 1997 Toyota Camry had been located. It was parked beneath a tree near a cluster of apartment buildings on the outskirts of Iowa City, one of which was linked to Lee. Residents told police that the car had been sitting there for weeks and was now giving off an overwhelming, unpleasant odor. Officers needed to wait for a warrant before opening it, but the smell coming from the vehicle was all too familiar to them. Once they had legal clearance, they opened the trunk and were met with a stronger wave of odor. Inside, they found a suitcase. When opened, it revealed a badly decomposing body, a dumbbell, and a bloody towel wrapped around the person's head. While formal testing was still pending, they were confident the body belonged to Tong Sha. This was later confirmed by an autopsy, officially identifying the remains as Tong, the Iowa State University student who had last been seen on the 8th of September. At the time, police didn't release a cause of death. Authorities announced that Tong had been found in the trunk of her own car and named Shangnan Li, a 23-year-old Chinese international student from the University of Iowa, as a person of interest. They believed he had already returned to China, though they were awaiting official confirmation. The autopsy later determined that Tong died from asphyxiation and blunt force trauma. Investigators suspected she may have initially survived a violent beating, only to later suffocate after being forced into the suitcase. Inside the car, they also found travel documents belonging to Lee, confirming his departure to China. Tong's phone, shattered and discarded, was left on the driver's seat. With confirmation that she was deceased, investigators returned to the motel, this time with a forensic team. The bloodied towel wrapped around her head had originated from inside the motel room. Using luminol, investigators detected traces of blood on several pieces of furniture, strengthening the connection between the room and Tong's death. CCTV footage later revealed that Lee had gone to a TJ Maxx store and purchased the exact suitcase in which Tong's body was eventually discovered. He was seen spending considerable time comparing sizes and testing how the suitcases rolled. In addition, he had bought 2 dumbbells from Walmart, one of which was found inside the case with Tong. Despite the growing pile of evidence, the motive remained unclear. They had simply gone on a weekend trip together, and yet something horrific happened just one day into it. However, the investigation soon took a new turn when officers interviewed someone who would provide information that significantly shifted the case. Meanwhile, the Iowa State University community held a somber memorial service on the south lawn of the campus to honor Tong. Dozens of students and friends gathered to remember her as a kind, grateful, and beloved young woman. James Dorsett, the director of the International Student Program, spoke through tears. In his 2 decades in the role, he had only lost 2 international students, Tong being one of them. He gave a heartfelt eulogy, pausing emotionally as he recalled their first meeting. He shared that whenever he passes a Dippin' Dots ice cream kiosk at the mall, he remembers her and the promise he made to one day try the treat she loved. Tong's closest friends were still too overcome with grief to speak publicly. The final speaker that evening was a friend of Tong's father, who had traveled from Virginia to pay respects. On behalf of Tong's family, she expressed deep appreciation to everyone who had shown support, offered condolences, and attended the vigil in memory of their beloved daughter. One of the calls Lee had made around the time Tong disappeared was to a woman named Karen, and it lasted over 3 hours. Investigators tracked her down to learn more. She revealed that Tong's private conversation on the 3rd of September, when she confided to a friend that she was planning to end things with Lee, had actually been overheard by him. During that conversation, Lee had called Tong, and she had unknowingly answered the phone. He stayed on the line for 30 minutes, listening to every word. After hearing it all, he became deeply upset and later posted a distressed message on social media. This detail, combined with how Tong was found, painted a clear picture of premeditation. Investigators believe that the dumbbell in the suitcase was part of a failed plan to sink the case in a river. Location data from Lee's phone showed that between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., he was near the Skunk River. Police theorized that he had gone there intending to throw the suitcase in, counting on the weight to keep it submerged. However, when they visited the river themselves, they saw the water was too shallow. This likely led Lee to abandon the suitcase in Tong's car instead. With all the pieces now in place, authorities were able to construct a timeline. After overhearing the conversation on the 3rd of September, Lee became enraged and began executing his plan. On the 5th of September, he and Tong checked into the Budge Inn & Suites. The following day, he made the incriminating purchases and booked a one-way flight to China. It was also the last time Tong was seen alive. On the 7th of September, after killing her, he returned to his apartment, packed a few belongings, and attempted to dispose of the body. Unable to dump it in the river, he left it in the car. He then used his phone, pretending to be Tong, to send messages to her friends and family, buying himself time. On the 8th of September, Lee was spotted in Chicago. He purchased a ticket to Los Angeles, then boarded a flight to China the next day, effectively fleeing. It wasn't until March 2015 that a warrant was issued for his arrest, but by then he was long gone. With no extradition treaty between China and the U.S., police were gripped by the possibility that justice for Tong might never be served, even if they now knew who was responsible. Even without a formal extradition treaty between the United States and China, some international law experts believed there was still a possibility of action. Public pressure within China, especially through social media, might influence the government's decision. Tong Sha's family, grieving and determined, hoped that awareness of the case would spread online and generate momentum that could not be ignored. As many pointed out, if enough people inside China demanded justice for a fellow citizen, it could push authorities to cooperate more openly with U.S. investigators. Former Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, who had extensive diplomatic experience in Asia, suggested that China's decision would likely hinge on the principle of reciprocity. In other words, if China were to consider helping the U.S. by detaining or prosecuting one of its citizens, they would expect something in return. But Quinn also stated that China wouldn't necessarily shield a murderer, especially since the victim was also Chinese. A realistic solution might involve trying Lee under Chinese law on Chinese soil, rather than handing him over to American authorities. While this wouldn't satisfy everyone, it was potentially a way forward. Detective Gonzalez, who had led the investigation from the beginning, remained determined to bring Tong's killer to justice, regardless of where he was hiding. He worked with the local district attorney's office to contact both the Chinese government and its embassy in Washington. To their relief, officials in China agreed to collaborate. They announced they would attempt to locate Li and handle the matter domestically. The case quickly became national news in China, gaining traction across digital platforms and news outlets. Soon, photos of Li were widely shared online. The Chinese public, now aware of the horrifying crime committed against a young student abroad, began calling for accountability. The hashtag #FindLi began trending, and digital momentum surged. While diplomatic negotiations were still ongoing and legal challenges remained, the tide appeared to be turning. What had started as a desperate local investigation now had international attention and a renewed path toward justice for Tong Sha. In May 2015, after months in hiding, Li finally turned himself in while staying in Wenzhou. Realizing that escape was no longer an option, he surrendered to authorities and was taken into custody. Chinese officials requested full cooperation from Iowa detectives, requiring every piece of documentation and evidence to transfer the case formally. By June, Li was officially under arrest and was set to stand trial in China, facing charges of intentional homicide. A year later, the trial began. Li pleaded guilty but claimed the killing had not been premeditated. He insisted that Tong had attacked him first, and he acted in self-defense. He denied any calculated intent and explained that he was already planning to return to China when everything unfolded. Li portrayed himself as someone deeply in love with Tong and devastated that she did not reciprocate his feelings. The trial lasted only 6 hours. Tong's parents were instructed not to attend, but her mother defied the order, storming into the courtroom in a distressed state. Overwhelmed by grief, she expressed that life had lost all meaning. At one point, Li's parents met privately with Tong's family. They offered a formal apology and pledged to pay 2 million yuan, roughly $300,000, as compensation for their son's actions. Under Chinese law, intentional homicide carried a wide range of possible penalties from a minimum of 10 years in prison to a maximum sentence of death. Tong's parents, believing in the gravity of the crime and the loss they endured, hoped for the harshest outcome. Her father referenced traditional justice values, believing that someone who had taken a life should be held accountable to the highest degree. Tong's father suffered a serious decline in health and was ultimately unable to travel to the United States to bring his daughter's ashes home. Back in Iowa, detectives acknowledged that her case had set a precedent for cooperation between China and the U.S. in cross-border criminal investigations. The district attorney emphasized how important this was, especially as the Midwest, particularly Iowa City, saw a growing number of international students from China. Ensuring their sense of safety, he said, was now more important than ever. Tong Sha was just 19 years old when her life was taken. She had taken a bold leap to study abroad, pushing herself beyond her comfort zone to achieve something greater and make her family proud. Her dedication, kindness, and resilience touched those around her. Her friends described her as someone full of life, who could make you laugh, support you in sorrow, and light up a room with her presence. She was on the path to a brilliant future that was cruelly cut short. Her closest friend Jean still carries a prayer book Tong once gave her. It remains open to a page marked on the last day they saw each other. The passage speaks of perseverance, faith, and walking forward through adversity, never truly alone. Jean draws strength from these words, believing it to be a sign that Tong is still with her in spirit, guiding, protecting, and reminding her of the bond they once shared. Tong's story is one of ambition, love, loss, and the tragic cost of manipulation and control. It forces us to reflect on how fragile life can be and the importance of protecting those who are far from home. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it to honor Tong's memory and raise awareness. No voice should ever be silenced without justice.